Hello, my name's Kyle Davis, and this is a video talking about the analytics of Monopoly, how it works, and a few interesting things that we could go over mechanically within the game, and overall why it takes so long, and looking at some things on how we can reduce that time. So first off, if you've ever played Monopoly, it is a game where you revolve around a board, and that board is very monotonous when it comes into going over everything that happens. So if we look at a base game here, you have your go space and you have a few extra augmented spaces, and then in between we have all of these tax spaces or event spaces for things to happen, which we're just going to call them positive and negative in case of money for this example. And overall, this game takes quite a long time due to a few specific facts within the rules and how things work out. So if we go back over to our PDF of the rules here and we look at some of the stuff that's going on, uh, some of the main identifying parts about this is when you go into buying property and you start looking at things such as what happens when you buy property. So you pay the price that is listed, and then you get the title card. But to get that title card, if you don't have enough money, what happens is you go into what is known as an auction, which then everyone starts bidding based off of the median price based on the back of the card, which is usually about cut at half the value, and you start doing a bid to see if anyone wants that piece. Usually it does sell for way less than normal, and someone gets cheated out of their space because they don't have any money usually. Then we also have the big moniker of when you pass go, you get $200. This is your main form of income, and general trend for this, if we're looking at percentile based, is it will take you about 5 turns on average to get around the board. So keep this in mind because that's going to come up in our example with our graphs in a little bit. But you also pay rent based off your cards for other people landing on your space, and this is another form of where your income comes in, and taxes start getting fairly high as you go. Now, there's a few other things that end up making this game take quite a long time that doesn't really explain what's going on through here, but I'll go through some of the stuff quickly. So first off is building hotels and housing shortages. So this is based off the concept that there's 32 houses in the game and there's 12 hotels in the game. And this equates out to if you don't have enough, basically you can't build any more if there's no more to be able to be gotten. And to get a hotel, you have to convert all four of your houses into hotels. And it would be one hotel per. And then those four houses go back into the box. But one of the general strategies that you end up seeing from this is people will spend all of the hotels blocking, or spend all the houses, excuse me, to block people from going and getting hotels. So what we end up seeing is a strategy to market people out of their highest quota based off you keeping your quota the highest from rushing houses. Now, along with this, another one is mortgaging your property and liquidating if you don't have any funds. And this is where some of the biggest parts come into play for Monopoly. And this is with liquidation, what you and mortgages, what you end up doing is you end up selling a bunch of stuff back to the bank to be able to pay for whatever debt you currently have. Now, this is at any time you can do this if you cannot pay. Along with that, usually people set up other rules that help extend this out so people don't just outright die, but that's not really our plan here. Our plan is to make this a more tolerable game overall. So, one of our big things we're going to be looking at here is liquidation. Next is going to be your tax income percentile. Now, this is something that is interesting because it doesn't have any mechanics in the game. But if you look at the game from an outright numbers standpoint, from doing market trends and looking at it based off of how the events work and everything, this game actually doesn't have as doesn't have the amount of money in it that you think in paper form. So what do I mean by that? I mean, when you look at everything on the board and all the materials and resources you have that you convert through as you go through the game, you end up having the $2,580 or the $20,580 that the game originally comes with, and you start with 15,000. But every property you get converts that money and basically doubles it. Now, that, plus being able to have certain cards, such as get out of jail free cards, being able to have special spaces that are the utilities, puts the tax income percentile gain that the bank gets back to an almost 2.5% ratio. So there's actually 2.5 times more money in the game, so you're looking at somewhere around uh, like 75,000 if we're looking at this in conservative terms for how much money actually flows through this game with everything that's happening. And that even transitions into your dice and having certain rolls, and the higher you roll, technically, the better your income tax percentile is. So these are some of the main things that we want to be looking at. So if I go over here and we start looking at our main diagram of what we have for a game of Monopoly. We're going to see it's a little bit of a mess, but I'm going to go over every part as we go through here. So I have this set up as a two-player game. So here are our two players, green and blue, and each one has their effective end condition of if they reach zero money, they die. And with this, I have a secondary resource fund here to show off the concept of liquidation. So because how liquidation works, you're going to end up having a split between the bank getting all of its money back and both players getting a little bit of extra income based off of turn percentage rating or of what they roll on their dice, between event cards that show up, and a bunch of other things. And to keep this a little bit more in wraps with what we're talking about here, I've rounded all the numbers down, so every $1 in this game is now worth $100 for what we have here. So this is actually $17,800, and each player has the traditional 1,500 to start with. So looking at that, that's how I have this set up, and that's why it's set up in such a weird, archaic way. But that's where we get into all of these different modifiers that we have. So here, these initial, like coming out of here to our players, that's when you pass go, you get $200. So you're going to get 2 units of money. From factoring in a bunch of the percentiles of all of the different events that can happen, we have it set up to a D10 chance of how much money you end up making as you revolve around the board. Now, I have this set up so that every time this runs, every one run is equivalent to 1 rotation around the game board. So it would be every 5 turns in this case, as an average. Note there's going to be trends since this is a dice-based game where we have some statistical odds and ends of someone doing really well to someone doing really bad. Next thing I want to show off is how everything ends up converting. So when you buy something, you go through what is known as our little tax distribution and our return here. So when you buy, you're going to spend, starting off, about $200 buying your base properties, right? So we have that set up here, and then this will cycle around and go back into the bank and distribute our liquidation funds back to our players to give them their extra cushion as the main game has. Now, with this, I have quite a bit of spiderweb here, and I'll go over exactly what all this means in a few here. So, the first thing we need to understand is the tax-based system of this game. You have player-based tax, you have bank-based tax, and then you have land-based tax. Now, we can take player and land-based tax and put them together because essentially that's the same thing. And I have this set up through a base percentile of, if I move these out of the way, you'll be able to see a little bit better that our base tax starts off with some certain percentiles based on what's happening here. So for this, it's kind of hard to show off here. Okay, so what we have here is our taxes. So this one here, when you pay into a tax, and we're going to say you always pay into a tax for this, and this is choosing a base trend game where you're going to do the average. You're going to pay about $200, anywhere from 100 to 200 into this base tax. And depending on if you land on a space that no one owns, it will go back to you. And this is simulating the free spaces that you end up getting. And at the beginning of the game, this is generally fairly high at a 60%. Then we see that there's always bank taxes that happen, and we have both of those for both players set at 10%. This we're going to leave as a static because there is more trends that you're going to find spaces that you hit that go to the bank more so than players at the early game, and it generally stays the same. There's no change in this, so we're going to have that as a static value. And then the last thing we have here is we have a 30% player tax going to your adversary, your second player, if you're a player one. So that's how we set this up, and then we have a bunch of things that trend around this to allow you to be able to modify these values. So if I open up the tile limit, as you know, or may not know, there's 28 buyable tiles in Monopoly. So this means that there's only 28 spaces that we can then increase our tax percentile that you end up going towards paying for those things. So for every time a tile is bought, we're going to increase our percentiles or decrease based around a 2.2% for a 30% rate to pay to a player. So that'll eventually trend towards somewhere about a 98% chance of you actually having to pay that player. A minus 2% on our percentage chance of our 60% chance of paying back to yourself because you're not going to be hitting those spaces as often. And then we have another set of values coming off here that just have a +1. Now what does that mean? That means it's trending towards the amount of tax you pay back to players or the bank. And this is because we're trying to simulate, as you go through the game, things get more expensive and everything trends to being a higher value. And we have it set up so that every time we get a return based off of our money for buying a space, it goes in and procs our integer for the amount of tiles. Now, not only do we do this, but we have a check that goes over to our house limits, because this also modifies our tax. Each of these we have to do in a slightly different way, because I don't know why they did it this way, but the amount of money houses give, depending on what tile they're on, is not the same. It's not consistent. So you have your base amount, which doesn't scale consistently, and then you have your secondary amount, which is the augments based off number of houses, or if you have a hotel on said space. And these don't add up at all. I could not find any correlation to them. It's anywhere from a 50% increase to like a 23% increase. It's very odd and doesn't make much sense for how it scales. So I've just set this as a median for every house that will be in the game, which we know there's 32 of, so we have our limit of 32. We add an incremental tax increase to both the percentile and also our D roll, or D20 or D2 rolls for adding onto a tax of how much you pay. We increase those by 0.5. Now, this doesn't always scale correctly when you start going over to hotels, so I just set these at 1 for each of these. So it's going to be a static 1 value. So every 2 houses is equivalent to a modifier of a hotel of 1, based off of the data that I could collect. Now, keep in mind how I have this set up. It does not get rid of the amount of houses when you make a hotel, because we're trending to say this is an amount of turns around the board where you make money based on every 5-ish turns. So you can realistically imagine if you are playing this game and using every rule to its utmost degree without trying to meta game, we're going to see a a point in the game where houses will always be spent at a consistent rate and hotels will always be set at a consistent rate, starting at a block of you need 4 houses to be able to make your first hotel, and we'll just keep these in circulation. And these are going to augment our numbers to make sure that we have the inflation we need for the general trend. So now explaining all of that, let's take a look at this thing running and see an idea of what's going on. But first off, I'd like to hide this because we'll explain what's going on down there in a bit. So if I run this, you'll see money shuffles through, and we have a fluctuation of money of the players constantly going up and the bank constantly going down at a certain interval. And if we look at our prices of everything, we have a general trend of all of our percentiles going up and going up by a huge percentage because of our houses adding a lot to this tax along with the overall set for our tile limits. And then we have this set up so that in this case, blue has lost. Blue has ran out of money, could not liquidate because the money was not transferring. So the next thing I want to drag your attention here towards is the bank. And notice that we now have $540 essentially in this account. Now, after taking the initial tax inflation based off market value, houses, and all of this liquidation, this is way ahead of what our initial bank value was, even though we have around the same amount of money for each player. Now, if we go back, you'll see it's 178. That's almost 5 times the amount of money. And this is the main problem with Monopoly that we want to address. Now, looking at this as a general trend on our graph here, we'll see most games of Monopoly on our turn cycle end up petering out somewhere around turn 20 to turn 60. That's ridiculous. Because, again, if you take that, each one of these is 5 turn rotations for how we have this set up. So that's 100 to 120 turns for this game to go. And that's not including all the math and everything else that ends up needing to happen. And if we look at this, we're looking at blue and green down here. We have general trends down here where they just sort of crescendo and then just start falling as hard as they rose throughout the game. And this happens for both sides. But if you notice this bank value, this was the initial static bank value. And it starts dipping really hard as we see the player's income rise. But as the players start buying an exorbitant amount of houses and terrain tiles, we see that market value go back to the game exponentially until it plateaus somewhere way off grid. And I'm using conservative numbers for our percentiles of what our tax increase is and what our player gain is in cost. So we end up with a far more large variation than we would like to see. And keep in mind that we're lopping off 2 zeros at the end of every number here. So we're looking at hundred thousands of dollars in value on this game board at any given time in a late game match. And because of the fact that most players are not going to be doing this, and they're going to be looking for viable strategies and hoard their money and play more passively, we're going to be seeing this increase exponentially as well, where they just flatline and choose to do nothing for turn after turn after turn while they get around the board. This is the most aggressive AI I could have set to show just the raw exponential process of what Monopoly is. Now, if we look at our other concept for Monopoly of taking out some of the main core systems that it has, such as being able to liquidate, if you remove that entirely, barely changing any of the numbers of the game of Monopoly, and barely changing how housing works, we end up with a system that is far more stable and ends far quicker. And you see far more variation and power spikes happen throughout the game. So just because of the fact that we don't have any of the additional tax income from liquidating, we can say we aren't doubling our money in this case because you never get to go back to that. It's just whatever money you have in your bank account in cash on your side of the field. We end up with something that looks more like this. Now, the only main difference here between each of these graphs is this portion here, where we have a return that instead of a 2.5 modifier of the tax, that then gets distributed into a liquidation fund for both players and the bank, we just set it up so everything filters through the bank. Because there is no liquidation, you can't sell back your property for the amount you're making, and it always stays the same. This makes the game look a lot more static as it goes, and we'll notice this is going to run out fairly quickly. Unlike the other one that took about 20 to 30 turns on an average for where it usually peters out, we're going to see that these usually go about 12 to 16 turns total. If it goes more than that, it's very shocking. There we go. 14. This is one of the more average trended games that we've had. And if we look at our 1,000 games played, and we look at this insane amount of variation over the course of this, we'll notice it peters out anywhere from about 19 turns to around 16. 14 to 16. This is where we want to be, because if you look at the game of Monopoly on a 5-turn scale, this is far more appealing than having a 26-turn game where you can recover at any point. Because this also makes it so that you either have to play far more passively with your money on hand because you can't get it back as easily to liquidate when you potentially go bankrupt. So, just showing off a little bit about how that would work and the changes that I would make to Monopoly if it was a potential for that, and how the statistics actually ends up working is quite interesting. I'm going to put some links down into the description here of these charts, along with the main thing to mess around with. I'm going to have it set up so that you can tell which one is which. But overall, these are really interesting systems to delve into because you're talking about economies and a huge portion of what actually changes and what the impact can potentially be. And this is just removing one mechanic from this core game loop that is very exponential. And I wanted to go over one other thing here and show off a little bit of an image of what I was doing while I was researching to see what the core game loop of Monopoly actually looks like when you look at it at a very macro level. And that is you have your player setting up to get your money from Go and get your rent income from going around the board, and we have this set to a die so that it's random and we can cover more turns more quickly. And you have your outgoing payment funnel, which isn't always correct because you can run out of money, so these two should be connected here for this, as you can run into an infinitely scaling game based off of this when you do this parameter. And also, it never takes into account you have finished buying property, so there's no way for you to be able to get any more out of your rent income increase as it goes, and setting up a bunch of these other systems, such as the main things that make this game balanced or not balanced, like your tax income rate based off the value of tiles. So, thank you for watching. I thought this was a pretty cool thing. I just want to share it off. So, have a good day.